I am very happy, more than happy, to celebrate the accomplishments of the West when it comes to letters, sciences, basic ideas about human rights and so on. In the same way that I consider the achievements of every civilization, the Chinese civilization, the Indian civilization, African civilizations, I consider every civilization's accomplishments to be my accomplishments, my heritage. But in times when a particular bloc, empire, call it civilization if you wish, it dominates and essentially through its dominance undermines the capacity of humanity to prosper. We need to turn our attention far more critically on the dominant culture and to expose its incongruities, its hypocrisy, the crimes against humanity that it perpetuates. And, you know, for the last centuries, it's been the West. So when people today say to me, but how can we tolerate here in Europe what's happening in Gaza? Well, my cynical answer is, we've done it before. Europe is responsible for the genocide of the natives, the First Nations in the Americas, in Australia, let's not forget, in New Zealand, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Namibia. There is a long trail of corpses of genocides, of genocidal behavior, which is, you know, one of the reasons why we have great cathedrals and great universities. You know, they were funded through the slave trade. They were funded through empire. You know, you go to Brussels, which is the capital of the European Union, most of it was built on the basis of the slave economy that they built on the back of the people of the Congo. So there's no sense in celebrating the good things without exposing all the crimes on which they have been founded. Well, 2008 was our generation's 1929. Capitalism had two moments when it nearly faced extinction. 1929 was one of them, 2008 was the other one. 1929 was overcome in the end through the Second World War, which revived capital accumulation in the capitalist West. It shifted from Britain to the United States, and through this tectonic shift, it revived itself for another 80 years or so, 70 years. In order to continue to be hegemonic, American-based capitalism did something remarkable in the 1970s. Essentially, if you think about it, the British Empire collapsed because eventually, once it became a deficit economy, and after it stopped being able to finance its deficits through India and through Malaysia, through the plunder of Asia, at some point collapsed. But this is absolutely a defining point about our era. The United States, after the late 1960s, when it too became a deficit economy, it managed to do something that had never been done by any empire in the past. Not the British Empire, not the Dutch Empire, not the Spanish Empire, not the Roman Empire. It rebuilt and grew its hegemony by becoming a very bankrupt country, by going deeper into the red, and by making the rest of the world's capitalists effectively pay for its deficits, because this is exactly what's been happening since the 1970s. So you have a new model of hegemony, where strength grows not on surpluses, but on deficits. Because of the power of the dollar, the Americans use their trade deficits, the American ruling class, not the people of America, who suffered just as much as the rest of the world from this transformation of the United States into a deficit country. The American trade deficit, which Trump talks about now as something that he needs to shrink, but nevertheless, the American trade deficit, by growing, it operated like a huge vacuum cleaner that was sucking into the United States the net exports of Germany, of Japan, of Southeast Asia, and later of China. And who was paying for this deficit? Well, the capitalists from these countries, France, Germany, Japan, China, Korea, and so on, they sent their dollars that they were making from the United States market because of the US trade deficit they were making, they were sending it back to the United States to finance the American state, the American army, American finance, and American real estate. So between the 1970s and 2008, that was the model of American hegemony. That was the globalization, what people refer to as globalization. That's what it was. It was the American ruling class turning itself into a rentier class, using its trade deficit to keep the rest of the world's capitalists going, while the rest of the world's capitalists sending their loot back to New York. Okay? On the back of this tsunami of money that was going back to New York, the Wall Street bankers built up these humongous derivatives, those toxic financial products that Warren Buffett once described as weapons of mass financial destruction. And those exploded in 2008. And the whole thing nearly died. American capitalism and global capitalism was saved by two forces, or two institutions if you want. China, that upped the ante, that increased production and invested massively to prop up the global system, and by the Federal Reserve, the central banks, Bank of America and all the other European central banks and the Central Bank of Japan, that minted $35 trillion in order to save capitalism. But, when you combine this huge flow of money, printed money, with austerity for the majority of people in America, in Europe, this combination of austerity and huge quantities of money, it operates like cortisone to a cancer patient. It makes you feel, the patient feels more uppity, reasonably well, but the cancer is doing its nasty business underneath the skin. And after 15 years of this, since 2008, with Obama and the Democrats totally betraying the people that entrusted them, that voted them in, essentially that was the reason why Trumpism was created. And therefore, this stagnating capitalism after 2008, aided and abetted by the rise of a new form of capital in big tech, which I call cloud capital that lives in the cloud, the proverbial cloud. It's not in the cloud, it's on Earth, and it's in the oceans, optic fiber cables, our iPads and mobile phones and cell towers and algorithms and AI bots and all that. All this has spelled the end of what we knew as capitalism. This is what I said in my last book. We have a new system, in my estimation. I call it techno-feudalism. It's a stage after capitalism. It's far worse than capitalism even. And it is a system which produces political fragmentation. It has fewer capacities to replicate itself than even capitalism had. And therefore, and this was my long-winded answer to your very succinct question, it creates this sensation that the West is finished. But, it's like a wounded dragon. The more wounded it is, the more it thrashes about, and the more dangerous it is for the people living within the West and primarily the people of the global South. I think it's a mistake to focus as much as he does on tariffs, because for his people, his team, and remember, his team is more important than him. In the same way that, the last 50 years, globalization, neoliberalism, all that was a result of another president who shocked the world. That was President Nixon, who in 1971 appended, effectively disintegrated, destroyed the post-world order that the Americans had created. It was actually far more poignant and, if you want, aggressive what he did, what Nixon did. But Nixon was not that much of an intellectual. If you asked him exactly what he was trying to do, he probably would have not been very coherent. But the people around him, Henry Kissinger, John Connolly, his Treasury Secretary, and Paul Volcker, who then later became the chairman of the Fed, they knew exactly what they're doing. And if you read their texts and their speeches and the minutes of their discussions in 1969 and 1970, you could see exactly what they were doing. Why am I saying that? Because we should not emphasize too much Trump. Trump has a team around him. He's a frontman. So there's Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, similarly to John Connolly, who was the Treasury Secretary of Nixon. He's got Stephen Miran behind him. He's got a number of people who know exactly what they're doing. And if you read what they're saying, for them, tariffs are just a tool. They're a means to an end. They're not the essence of it. As far as they're concerned, and I think that Trump also thinks that way, the intention is to bring them down at some point. The project of the Trump team, the purpose and the intention of the Trump shock, which, as I said, is an attempt to revive the Nixon shock of 50 years ago, they are very clear on what they want to do. They want to devalue the dollar while maintaining the dollar's dominance. Now, that sounds like a contradiction, but it is not, because Nixon did that. Nixon devalued the dollar massively in 1971, after the 15th of August 1971, massive devaluation of the dollar. But through devaluing it, he created the circumstances for the dollar to become more hegemonic and more dominant as the world's currency than ever. Now, the Trump team are fearful, they worry, that the dollar may lose its hegemony. And what they want to do is they want to bring its value down in relation to its exchange rate vis-a-vis the pound, the yen, the yuan, the euro, and so on. They want to bring it down by around 30%, while at the same time forcing those foreigners who have lots of dollars, whether they are central banks or privateers, to sell their dollars, but not to buy the yuan, the Chinese currency, not to buy the yen, the Japanese currency, not to buy the euro to maintain their hegemony. So is this plan going to work? I don't know. Who knows? If this was a conversation we were having in 1971, would we be able to predict whether the Nixon shock would work? No way. No one can make these predictions. But to dismiss the Trump team as a bunch of Neanderthals, which is what the liberal establishment is doing both in the United States and in Europe. If you read the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, they dismiss them as a bunch of idiots. This is a major error. It's the same error they made in 1971 against Nixon. So if you ask me, will it work? I don't think it will work. But we should take very seriously what their intentions are, and we should differentiate between the means and the ends. The tariffs are not the ends, they're the means. He's putting them up there as a bargaining chip in order to convince different countries to do different things. He doesn't want the rest of us to do the same thing. He wants each one of us to do a different thing. So when it comes to the Japanese, for instance, the Japanese have $1.2 trillion in savings. He wants them to sell them. And he wants them to buy very long-dated, low-interest rate American debt. He wants them to buy crypto, especially Tether, or some stable coin which is linked to the United States dollar, because if they do that, they are selling dollars, the dollar goes down. But what they're doing is they are putting the money into a US dollar-denominated asset, which then is covered by buying, Tether buys 30-year long dated US treasuries. So they have a plan, right? Who doesn't have a plan? Europe, the United Kingdom. They are, politicians that are running around like decapitated chickens, not knowing what's going on. The only people who have a plan are the Chinese and some other countries like South Korea and Vietnam, who are far more in tune with what is happening. I consider Trump to be a clear and present danger for civilization, but I am aghast when I see liberals, in particular liberal opponents of Trump, dismiss him as a buffoon who doesn't know what he's doing. This is a very dangerous form of complacency. As you said, the genocide has been financed and armed by Biden, by the Democrats, by the German government, by the French government, by the Italian government, by the European Union. The liberal establishment is primarily responsible for the genocide of the Palestinians. Have been for yonks now, right? They wax lyrical about the two-state solution. If you push them about their complicity to the genocide, that is the liberals, the centrists, they say, yeah, but we support the two-state solution. This is simply something they say in order to cover up for their complicity in the genocide. Because they are arming the man who has spent his whole life, that is Netanyahu, destroying any possibility of a two-state solution. While arming him to destroy the possibility of a two-state solution, the liberal centrists in the United States and the European Union have been proclaiming the two-state solution, right? Between you and I. And I hope this is not taken out of context. I prefer Trump, because Trump says, okay, now what is the logic of arming Netanyahu? That he's going to kill every Palestinian there is, or expel them, the ones who have survived and haven't died of bullet wounds or drone attacks or starvation or thirst, right? So what happens then? We have a big empty land in Gaza. Okay, I'm going to take it over and I'm going to build my Trump land there. And I am going to celebrate this with my friend Netanyahu. He is far more honest and logically coherent than all these supposedly nice sweet centrists who've been talking about a two-state solution, but have been complicit in the total annihilation of any chance of a two-state solution. I'm not at all surprised. It is utterly consistent with everything that has been happening in Palestine since the Nakba, since 1948. The doctrine of the Israeli apartheid state has been consistent. We will kill 100 people for every one of our soldiers or settlers who is impeded from carrying out the ethnic cleansing. They've been remarkably stable in this in this pursuit. If I am surprised by something, I have to say, and that's because of my naivete. It was, for instance, when in April of 2024, the German authorities banned me from entering Germany, even by Zoom, even by the medium that you and I are using today to discuss. I have to tell you that I never expected them to be so blatant in the ease with which they were destroying the very concept of the rule of law in Europe. I was expecting them to be more careful when it came to jeopardizing the facade of a Europe that is rules-bound. Banning a citizen of the European Union from traveling to Germany because he doesn't support the genocide of Palestinians, and banning him too electronically. I have to tell you that this was beyond the limits of my imagination. It more or less entertained me because I realized that they must be particularly stressed by the subconscious. There must be only a subconscious guilt over their complicity to the genocide. They simply are in denial. So they like toddlers, like toddlers throwing a tantrum. Our European leaders are behaving with such wanton disrespect to the rules which supposedly ought to govern their behavior, which they have waxed lyrical about, for decades now. That, I have to say, surprised me to some extent.